Okay, so this lesson's designed to really just kind of give you a general idea on the overview of metaphysical poetry as we move further into our poetry unit. So some poets that we're probably going to be reading and then that you're probably going to be experienced with are all going to be classified as metaphysical. And those are John Donne, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell. There are a lot more, but those are a lot of the big heavy hitters that you'll probably be experienced. You'll be come into contact with. And then it's usually more of a stylistic category, so it's not, a comment on more political ideals or anything like that. It's more of a style of this type of poetry, and that's why it's classified as metaphysical. Metaphysical usually means kind of philosophical ideas on the nature of being, but relatively few of the actual metaphysical poets actually write about this stuff. There are a few that do, but that's not kind of the only category that goes into this. So kind of keep in mind that metaphysical poets are closely linked, but really just overlap with cavalier poets, which are something a little bit different. It's more of a political category, and they are usually royalists who are loyal to Charles I, and they have more secular topics generally. It's more of a carpe diem, like seize the day, love type of poetry. And so examples are probably going to be Robert Herrick, Richard Lovelace, so people like that. So just keep in mind that they overlap with each other sometimes. So in the category of metaphysical poetry, there are kind of some disunities in some of the subject matter and other things like that. So in the subject matter, we see a lot of different things, a lot of varying things. Remember I said earlier that they're not always going to be talking about the philosophy of being in general. A lot of times we're going to see amorous or ideas of love, we're going to see satire, and then some religious commentary too in the poems. There's some disunity in the religions of the actual poets and the religions that are explored in the poetry. So there's a broad range of Catholic, Anglican, Protestant. There's some that are practice Arminianism. John Donne's a big one in that category. And then their political loyalties kind of vary as well. If you remember to the Cavalier poets, they are generally just loyal to Charles I. Here we see a lot of disunity in the political loyalties of each poet. Some common features, though, of metaphysical poetry is going to be, we talked about earlier, the metaphysical conceit. And if you remember, that is making a big abstract, kind of like a metaphor, a big abstract comparison to something that's more concrete. So when we read George Herbert, The Windows, he's comparing very spiritual things to something very concrete, which are windows. So that's usually what a metaphysical conceit is. There is an exploration of the nature of religion and love, and sometimes, especially in John Donne poetry, we see an interesting mix of religion and love coming into play in the same poems, which is really interesting. The speaker in these poems is usually talking to God, or he's talking to a female lover, and these are generally persuasive or argumentative, trying to make a proposition or things like that. And then we see a lot of ordinary language, and this is really different when we consider our Elizabethan poetry and literature of that type of nature, or if you remember our Italian sonnets. We have a lot more common, a lot more ordinary language. It's not as ornate. George Herbert is a big mover in this idea, and basically it's just all less self-consciously elaborate. That's kind of what George Herbert classified it as being really self-consciously elaborate when they use words that are kind of more ornate than just ordinary language, and so that's something really important too to keep in mind. So remember to keep these in mind when we're looking at the metaphysical poetry, and we'll get more specific as we get into each work, but these are kind of like the main outliers in metaphysical poetry.